Thanks to all of you for joining us today on this webinar about tips and best practices for conducting a street law program online. My name is Ben Perdue, and I'm from Street Law Inc., coming at you from my home, obviously, as everyone is in Washington, D.C. It's very nice to see a lot of you here. I see some faces and names that I recognize and some new ones. Good to see we have some of our friends from across the pond in the UK and Ireland joining us. Thanks, guys. I'm going to turn things over to Amy and her students, Mina and Delali, in just a second. But a couple of quick sort of housekeeping notes before we get started. One request is if all of you could go into your Zoom settings and update your name to include, in parentheses, your university or affiliation or location right after your name. That way, if we're using the chat, we can sort of see not only who you are, but where you're from. That would be very helpful. And talking about the chat, please utilize the chat. While Amy and Delali and Mina are speaking, we're going to ask everyone to keep themselves muted just so we don't have crazy crosstalk going on. But if you have questions or you have something to add, or if you want to sort of engage, we really encourage you to use the chat, because we're hoping that we can have sort of a lively conversation going in the chat. So, and finally, in the last 20 minutes or so of the session, we're going to break everyone into small groups to give everyone a chance to kind of debrief in a smaller setting with a smaller number of people. And we'll have some guiding questions for you for that, but we really hope that you'll take the opportunity to sort of get to know the people in your group and sort of build up your community of support. So without any further ado, let's dive right into it. Amy Wallace from New York Law School is going to lead us through some of her tips and best practices, and her students, Mina and Delali, are going to jump in at various points. So Amy, Mina, Delali, take it away.
Thanks, Ben, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. In true street law style, as Ben said, I don't want this to be a lecture. I welcome any comments or questions as we go along. Ben will be monitoring the chat and will either toss questions back to me, or we can answer some of them at the end, and my students also might be answering some questions if they have the answers for them. So as a roadmap for today's seminar, I want to start by briefly discussing what our program looked like pre-COVID, so you can see how it changed. And then I'll explain how we taught in March when the pandemic hit New York City, and then how we taught over the summer at our Summer Bridge program. Then two of my amazing New York Law School students, Delali and Mina, are here with me, and they'll speak about their experiences teaching the Summer Bridge program this summer. And then I'm going to talk about some of the lessons that we learned between the emergency remote teaching and the planned distance teaching that we did. And I will incorporate some of the tips I learned from countless professional development opportunities that New York Law School offered, and while taking a course on online legal instruction that I did over the summer. And then finally, as Ben mentioned, we're going to break into groups, and hopefully you guys can talk about your plans for the fall, if you know what they are, what you'd like to do. And there's a ton of experience in this room, so I would love for everyone to share all the advice that you have on going from here. So these are my happy law students pre-COVID. I started teaching street law at New York Law School in the fall of 2017. Our program is offered for credit both in the fall and in the spring semesters. And depending on how many high school classes we'll be teaching, I have between 8 and 10 law students each semester. And separately, as Mina and Delali did, New York Law School law students teach a 3-week, 12-day intensive summer bridge program each July for all the incoming 9th graders at our partner high school. And we teach at the Charter High School for Law and Social Justice in the Bronx, New York. This high school was actually founded by a professor at New York Law School, and we have a very close relationship with the school. So typically, my law students teach 4 to 5 classes at the high school each Friday. In the fall semester, we typically teach criminal law and end the semester with a mock trial that we hold at New York Law School. And in the spring, we teach criminal procedure, which typically ends in oral arguments also at the law school. This is a picture taken after mock trials in the fall at New York Law School. And then everything changed for all of us, right? So New York Law School was on March break, and I was actually in Utah with my family when the number of COVID infections began to explode in New York City. Things progressed extremely quickly from the beginning to the middle of March, with only 29 documented cases on March 7th and almost 5,000 by March 20th. So on Sunday, March 15th, the New York City Board of Education moved all schools to remote learning. I was actually on a plane when the announcement was made, and I remember landing at JFK to 1 million emails and texts from my law students. So we, like most of you, had to shift gears instantly. We were supposed to teach that Friday, and I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. But the one thing that I did know was that I didn't want my law students to stop teaching. They needed to keep teaching, and our high school students needed us to keep teaching. So after 20 years of working with street law and law-related education, all I could think was we had to teach live remote classes. We had to have discussions and group work and interaction, because that's what street law was all about. Like our high school, like most schools around the world, was scrambling, and synchronous teaching was not an option. So at that point, I just had to readjust all of my expectations to what was possible. The remote plan at our high school was that students were given asynchronous assignments for 2 subjects each day. The school said they would understand if we didn't want to continue, but it was all hands on deck. And so if we could deliver 1 asynchronous lesson per week, that would be amazing. So I really want to give a shout out to my incredible law students. With everything that was going on, with everything they were dealing with, switching to virtual law school classes themselves, quarantine, and illness, they just pivoted and they just said, what can we do? I was, and I am still very proud of them. So we wanted the high school students to continue to see the law students. So we decided to record short videos introducing the week's assignment and covering any substantive law for the week. The videos were then uploaded by the school with any written assignments. So I'm gonna show you an example. This is an example of one of the videos that was recorded by my law students and then uploaded for the high school students.
Hi, street law students.
Can everybody hear that?
First and foremost, I hope everyone has been doing well and staying safe. I also want to note how proud we are of you and how proud you should be of yourselves for taking the time amongst all of the craziness in the world to continue to pursue your studies and putting the effort in. So make sure to take the time to give yourself a round of applause. That's for you. All right, today we will be examining the meaning of the Fourth Amendment and how the Fourth Amendment is argued by parties during oral arguments in a moot court, like the one we're going to be doing. Now, a quick reminder, this is going to be really important for you as we get closer to the end of the year and you continue to prepare for the oral arguments that you're going to be writing and hopefully recording. Now think back to the class about juvenile rights, and I know it feels like forever ago, but think back to it. We talked a lot about when schools or police officers are allowed to search your backpack or your locker. Those rights protecting people from unreasonable searches and seizures is what the Fourth Amendment is all about. As you will see, the Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. But ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? Are these protections absolute, or is there space for courts to interpret their meaning? Now, in the packet you have today, you're going to find 4 things. 1, a Fourth Amendment rule page that provides some background and meaning to the Fourth Amendment. 2, a short example of what a warrant looks like with questions attached. 3, the background and facts on a really important case called Carpenter versus United States. This is the case to know. Our next assignment will also be about Carpenter, so make sure you understand what's going on in this case. And then 4, you're going to have a sheet with questions about the facts of the case and the issue that the court is trying to decide. Normally, we have more exercises for you to try and apply the law, but today is simply about learning what the Fourth Amendment means and familiarizing yourself with the facts and issue of the Carpenter case. If you have any questions while you're working on this, or about anything else regarding the street law program, please visit our Zoom chat on Mondays between 12:30 and 2 p.m. Do not hesitate. We miss you. We want to hear from you. And that's everything. So good luck on this week's assignment and have a great spring break.
So one of the things that I love about this video, in addition to covering the material in a calm and slow fashion, Mike's smiling and so upbeat for his students during what was such a dark time in New York City. So training my law students was also a new challenge. Suddenly I had 10 law students preparing one lesson per week instead of each preparing for their own classroom. I wanted the law students to continue to build their own skills, so I had each team prepare a detailed proposal each week, just explaining how they would cover that topic. Then each team would circulate their proposal to the entire class, and law students were required to prepare constructive comments on all of the proposals in time for seminar. Then we as a group would decide which proposal to go with for that week. Using this model, the law students continued to learn substantive legal topics, and they continued to deconstruct that material into interesting lessons for our high school students. And although we were all frustrated not to be able to see them and interact with the high school students, we knew we were doing the best that we could at that time. We had just started our moot court unit when we went remote, so the law students had to teach that entire unit remotely, which meant they had to teach difficult concepts like precedent, case comparisons, and present the actual moot court problem to them virtually. And we really didn't know what to expect from the final arguments, but we received some amazing statements from our young students. This is one example that I'm going to give you a second to read. Oh, I went backwards. Sorry about that. So I think it was then, once we finally received their written statements, that we realized that it certainly wasn't perfect, but our high school students were still learning. They were still developing critical thinking skills and advocacy skills. So it was totally worth it. When the decision was made to run the Summer Bridge program virtually, we were able to offer the program synchronously. Now, Summer Bridge is typically 3 hours a day, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. of interactive, fun street law lessons. So how are we going to do that virtually? Over the spring, between teaching and taking courses on teaching remotely, I knew that 3 hours of Zoom was exhausting for an adult and would be completely unproductive for 13 and 14-year-olds. So we decided to split the time into manageable bites. So this is the schedule for each day of Summer Bridge. The students had class via Zoom from 9:30 to 10 each morning. Then they would sign off and do an independent activity that we'd posted on Google Classroom. And I'll show you Google Classroom in a minute. And then they would sign back on from 10:30 a.m. till about 11. And they would typically discuss in the groups what they had done during their independent work. Now, the charter school was using Google Classroom for their asynchronous teaching in the spring, and it was also widely used by the New York City middle schools where most of our 9th graders would be coming from. So we chose to continue with Google Classroom as our platform to support our synchronous teaching. So I'm actually going to show you Delali, who we'll hear from shortly. I'm going to show you her Google Classroom page. So this is Delali Madison's course page. She's going to be talking to you in a minute. And so you can see from the general course page, this is where you can post announcements or anything you want your class to see. And then if you go into the classwork, you have to set up these categories, and then it's super organized. So each day is here, and under each day, all the handouts are there. So it's really easy for the students to find their handouts. So this is one of the activities that we did. No vehicles at the beach. And this is a lesson that I modified from No Vehicles in the Park, which is an activity that most of you are probably familiar with, either from teaching street law or in your law school classrooms. We tried to make these lessons as relevant to the students as possible. With so much going on outside of the classroom, we wanted to give them a chance to talk about it in the context of our lessons. And the high school students did an amazing job applying the specific COVID legislative intent of this rule to the hypos that they looked at after. The language of this rule is exactly the same as the language in No Vehicles in the Park, but the students were really able to apply the social distancing legislative intent here. The great thing about Google Classroom, for those of you who've never used it, is when you post an assignment, okay, I'm gonna go down to this one. When you post an assignment, this was the hate speech worksheet that we assigned for independent work during our lesson on freedom of speech and protest. So if you create an assignment, it automatically creates a copy of that assignment for every student. So the student just completes the worksheet electronically and submits it that way. And then you can give comments back that way as well. So it really makes it easy. So I would like to give my unflappable law students, Delali and Mina, a chance to talk about their experiences during Summer Bridge. Both of these students were in my Advanced Legal Methods class. And when they applied for the summer positions, I knew they would be amazing teachers. I didn't know quite how amazing they would be, but I wasn't surprised. Delali, Mina?
Hi, I'm Philomena. So there are a few things that definitely changed the way that we interacted with the students. There are some positives and then there are some negatives. And I think that the most important thing for us was to make sure that we were able to make it feel as though we were still in a classroom, a physical classroom, regardless of being online. So there are just a few things that we looked out for and tried to modify based on the classroom that we were in. So for my classroom, the chat function is something that we definitely wanted to disable. The particular students that I had, once they noticed that the chat function was available, it sort of barred them from wanting to unmute themselves and speak in the classroom. So that definitely depends on the type of students that you may have in your classroom. But for my classroom, the chat function was something that we wanted off. And secondly, Zoom allows us to give remote control access to other participants. So in trying to figure out ways to make a Zoom very interactive with the students, I tried to allow students to have remote control access of essentially my computer. So if I shared a document to the screen, it was in a sense able to allow them to type in their answers from the group work. My students were not a fan of that. So that's something to sort of try out with your students and see what it is that they like and what they don't like. We thought that they would enjoy being able to put their own work on the screen. My class was not too enthused to do that. But then there were things that were really, really great to get the classroom really feeling like we were in person. So breakout rooms were a great part of our classes. The one thing to note that it sort of took a lot of trial and error is when you end a breakout room, the timing left over. So it ranges from about 5 seconds to 59 seconds that they allow the students to either come back to the main session or stay in their group. When I left it with 59 seconds, that sort of wasted some time because some students would come back, some students would stay. So that took some trial and error, but definitely note that you can change the amount of time that it takes for the breakout rooms to close down. But breakout rooms definitely help the students really kind of come out of being silent and talk with their group members. And then I would pop into each group and just sort of drop a provoking question and make sure that they were on task. But they did seem to feel more confident when it was just them and another peer. And then the last thing that worked really, really well that Professor Wallace mentioned is the Zoom break that we were able to take. So it was about 15 minutes and we would give them something to do within those 15 minutes. So they were able to either get a snack, take a break, and then they had an assignment to complete. But the best thing about the Zoom breaks is that we told them to just mute their Zoom and they can shut off their camera. And so there was still that slight pressure that they were still logged onto the call, but they were able to take that break and definitely like gather their thoughts and then submit the assignment. Yeah, so those are my positives and negatives.
Thank you, Mina. Delali?
Hi everyone, I'm Delali. I'm a 2L at New York Law School. So first I just have some, sorry for the noise. So first I just have some suggestions for law students that may be teaching for the first time, or for me, I did teach a little bit before law school, but I was just really nervous. So I think preparation is key to your success, especially in the beginning. I would prepare my lesson plans as if I was teaching in person, because I realized there were times that I was relying too much on my notes, and then it takes away from the flexibility and control of the classroom. Number two, I prepared multiple ways to ask the same question or communicate the same idea, because some of our students are at different levels. So some students may understand something the first time you say it, but others you just might need to rephrase. And for me, that helped a lot with awkward silence. And it also, oh, and then not only to rephrase, but to repeat. I think although we love the breakout room function, if you don't have like a teacher's assistant in every breakout room, there were times where I would be floating through breakout rooms and I would notice that the students hadn't started their assignment. And I'm like, hey guys, like, what have you been doing? And then they'll say, well, we were just a little confused about what we were supposed to do. So I think if you rephrase and repeat, you wouldn't run into that issue. Number three, I think always have a plan B, especially if you're going to be using functions on Zoom. I think there were times that, you know, maybe a breakout room wouldn't work in the way I wanted to, or maybe I had difficulty uploading a poll. But if you have a plan B and you're nervous, you won't freeze, right? Something, and these are just two things that are just really simple, but I think are important for new educators, just to download all required documents and beforehand. So when you're sharing your screen, you're not, you know, wasting time, or your time and the student's time. Exit out of all windows that you're not using for that time period, and make sure that your computer is fully charged, or you are charging your computer. I know there was one day, like I had 5%, I didn't know exactly where my charger is, and then that just adds to the nervousness. So just to get rid of that, you know, make sure your computer is charged. In terms of pros, when I was facilitating, I would sign on like maybe 5 to 10 minutes early, just because I know some students are shy talking and just talking on Zoom in general. So if you log on early and you can have like a simple conversation, like, what did you guys eat for breakfast today? They'll just start talking, and just having them say something is a good start. Constantly remind the students to turn on their camera. We definitely had more interaction when students' cameras are off, but I think it's very easy for students to feel like we're not paying attention to them because they are behind their screen. But if you're constantly reminding them, like, oh, hey, turn on your camera, they'll know that we're attentive and that we value seeing them. So for me, and I know in Mina's class, the chat function didn't help, but for me, the chat function was useful. I did have a student that had an accent and that was really smart, but just didn't want to participate because of his fear and his nervousness. So we allowed him to use the chat function, or maybe, students that are not as confident, and students that are just in a situation where it's not conducive to be on Zoom, like they have, 4 siblings and their background is really noisy. We would tell the students at the beginning of class that speaking is preferred. However, if you're having Wi-Fi connection issues, or, we can't hear you, use the chat. And my last point is that like an interactive class is obviously the best. After definitely by Wednesday, our students were tired, right? So even like utilizing polls, we would get like 90 to 100% participation with that. And something that's great about polls is that students then commit to their answers, and they're more willing to justify their answer than switching to what the majority of the class said. Another feature that's a really simple feature on Zoom but helpful is the reaction feature. At times, if I was not getting a response, maybe I would have to lay out the argument, and I would say, okay, give me a thumbs up if you agree with this argument, and give a thumbs down if you disagree. That was really helpful. And then if you can, it was really helpful to have a TA in the class that would monitor chat and share their screen, because it just does get a little overwhelming when you're doing chats, sharing a screen, facilitating breakout rooms, keeping track of time. So just having somebody else there, an extra set of hands, was definitely helpful.
Thank you both for that. And I'd like to point out that Delali always says how shy she was, and no one would ever know that either when she was teaching or now, but she always says she's shy. But okay, I'm gonna share my screen. So what did we learn from all this? The first thing that I learned when I was approaching all this was to learn as much as I could, which is why I'm so glad that we're all here today and we can be sharing our experiences with each other. And I hope that those conversations continue. I think Streetlaw is going to be sending out contact information if you opt in for that. So I attended every available course and workshop and seminar that I could on online teaching, and New York Law School actually offered us a 7-session course with the Center for Computer Assisted Legal Instruction, or CALI, and that was very helpful. So all of these seminars were geared for teaching law school classes, but I knew they would still have something useful for me. I did laugh from time to time when the experts would suggest something groundbreaking like Think, Pair, Share, which is a pretty regular event for those of us who teach street law. But in examining what I learned in the courses together with our experiences teaching in the spring and teaching in the summer, I can divide the information sort of into 2 broad categories: class structure and class content. So in terms of class structure, the first thing you need to ask yourself and likely speak to the school about is whether you'll be teaching synchronously or asynchronously, or maybe a little bit of both. So as I mentioned at the beginning, when the schools initially closed, my first instinct was it has to be synchronous or there's no point in teaching street law. But our experience in the spring taught me that that wasn't true. Productive skill building learning can happen asynchronously if synchronous teaching is impossible. It's just a stopgap, but I believe that some street law is better than nothing. And then something else to consider is the value of adding asynchronous elements to a synchronous classroom. As proponents of street law, we all know that lectures of any length are sort of antithetical to street law teaching methodology. But what I learned in my coursework is the value of short videos. Some, if not all, street law classes start with some part where the instructor's explaining a topic or introducing a new concept. So even if it's just a few minutes, you might consider pre-recording that lecture piece. And the advantage of that is the students can listen to those videos at a time that's where they're most able to learn. Like Delali mentioned, there are times when people's households are not conducive to learning. So maybe the time that's scheduled for synchronous class is kind of a busy time in their household, so they can listen to that content piece at a time when they can really focus. When we were teaching synchronously in the summer, you know, as Delali mentioned, some students would unmute themselves to speak and the background noise was so loud that I don't know how those students were focusing, which really just is a testament to how much those students really wanted to learn. So they might choose to listen to that video at a different time, or they might choose to listen to it multiple times to make sure they fully understand what you're talking about. In addition, that frees up your synchronous time to focus on your interactive activities. And this becomes really important when we start talking about class length and Zoom fatigue. So I'm gonna have my law students pre-record very short videos in advance of each of their classes in the fall just to introduce their topics. Because the school where my law students will be teaching is still waiting to hear which of their proposed schedules has been approved. We have no idea what our schedule is gonna look like. But I know one of the possibilities, and I know something that some of you might be dealing with, is sort of an A schedule and a B schedule. So we might have A Fridays and B Fridays, which means that some of my law student teams will teach on some Fridays, but then not the next. And if that's the case, I am gonna have my law students post something, a short article, a cartoon, something with a writing prompt that the students will have to answer discussion board style on Google Classroom. Something to just keep the dialogue going and keep the skill development happening on the off week. And this might be something you might want to consider if you don't see your students as often. It's actually one of the benefits of virtual teaching is that you can keep the lesson going after everyone has left the classroom. If you do choose to pre-record short videos, I would recommend starting synchronous class with some structured questions that check for understanding on the video. It is kind of interesting to me that the short videos that we did in the spring, I was so worried that they were going to be, you know, a poor substitute for in-person teaching, and now I'm planning to incorporate them into our fall plan. So the next question you'll need to answer is, how long should your synchronous class be? For most people, that's going to be predetermined by your cooperating school, but if you do have some input, or you do get to choose. From the experts that I've listened to over the last few months, most say about 45 minutes is pretty much the length you should aim for. Zoom fatigue is a real thing. Because we can't see body language, we use way more energy on Zoom to show that we're engaged and interesting, and that can be exhausting. And that was why we scheduled the summer program like we did, 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off. So as Mina mentioned, we sometimes went over, so it was maybe 15 or 20 minutes off. But at least they had that off time. So 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off, and then 30 minutes back on. And one of the possibilities for us for the fall, I know, is 110-minute blocks, which that's a really long time. And if that is the schedule that we get, I'm going to again suggest some version of the 30-30-30 schedule. Class size. So you may not have control over your class size. I know we won't in the fall. But if you do get some input, I would suggest smaller classes, maybe 20 students. I think if you can't see everyone on a single page of your Zoom screen, it's going to be challenging to keep everyone engaged. We actually started the summer with 2 separate Zooms. Jalali was heading up one and Mina was heading up another one, and both the classes were small, so I suggested we combine them one day. I thought it would be beneficial for the high school students to interact with each other and to hear each other's perspectives, and it actually had the opposite effect. Both the classes participated less, so we switched back to our separate Zooms the next day. Number of instructors. As I think both Jalali and Mina mentioned, lots. In a typical face-to-face classroom, I pair the instructors because I think it works really well with group work, and one instructor can be walking around the room to nip any potential classroom management issues in the bud. And I actually try not to send more than 3 instructors into a single classroom because I feel like it overwhelms the class and will reduce class participation. We did not find that to be the case on Zoom. We were fortunate that we had some law students who had extra time and wanted to volunteer. So as Jalali was mentioning, we had TAs in the class, and it was so helpful to have those extra adults on the Zoom because, as they mentioned, we would join the breakout room and there'd be complete silence. No one would be speaking. And once the adult joined the room, the students would turn their attention to whatever they were supposed to be doing, but they definitely needed the encouragement and the supervision. And that was particularly true for us because our students were 9th graders who didn't know each other. So if we do end up doing A days and B days in our fall schedule, my plan is to have the law students who aren't teaching support in the classes where their fellow law students are teaching. So we have as many people supporting the Zooms as possible. The last thing is platforms. So as we've mentioned, we use Zoom and Google Classroom in the summer. This is something also that's probably going to be predetermined by whatever your cooperating school is planning to use. And I know there are a ton of programs out there. This summer, I learned about 1 million programs, cool things you could do with fancy polls and word clouds and liquid syllabi. And it's really easy to get super excited about all these cool things that you can show your students and get their attention. Or you might be overwhelmed by all this, depending on your level of comfort. But honestly, the most important thing that I learned about all that is to keep it as simple as possible. Most street law programs are aimed at underserved communities where some students may struggle with access to technology. And we had many students joining us on Zoom on their phones. And for those students, it's really difficult to access a bunch of different programs on your phone while you're also on the Zoom. I actually was, because we had 2 classes going on, I was on one Zoom on my computer and then another Zoom on my phone, depending on whether I was in Mina's or Jalali's class. And when I was on my phone, it was very difficult to maneuver around. You do need some form of a web-based learning platform like Google Classroom so that the students can have access to materials and submit assignments. Our high school actually has several class sets of the street law textbooks, so they are going to send those home as part of a scheduled book pickup at the beginning of the semester. So assuming that goes as planned, we're going to try to use the book as much as possible so the students will physically have that and won't have to be going back and forth between platforms. So before I move on, I want to talk about silence on Zoom for a second. So we are all comfortable with silence in an in-person classroom. There are times when the students are reflecting, and there are times when they're writing down answers. And yet we are all very uncomfortable with silence on Zoom. And one of the things I learned in my courses this summer is that we all need to get over it a little bit. It's okay to have silence virtually. The students need time to process the same way on Zoom as they would in the classroom. So to that end, I'd like to stop for a second, and I would like you all to think about something that you've heard today from me or Mina or Delali, and something that surprised you. And I'm going to give you an actual minute to think about it. Okay, now I would like for you guys to write down what you thought about, and please put it in the chat. And I'm not going to be able to see the chat, so someone else is going to have to share it what some of the answers are. Mina, you're smiling. Can you do it?
I don't see anything yet. Using reactions sounds like a great idea to check for understanding. Yes. There were times, at least for me, I don't know if I'm supposed to comment, but there were times for me where I would ask a question like, oh, do we all understand? And then there was just silence. So I would always say like, okay, I need 2 yeses, and then I can move on. So then it would just compel 2 or 3 students to say, yes, I understand, or using the reactions. Love the use of poll suggestion, taking a Zoom break. Yes, that's the best.
I wish they would do that for all of us adults also sometimes. Okay. Thank you for sharing. So the second sort of category of things that we learned and sort of we put together is class content. So let me start by saying that I don't think any of these concepts are going to be new to most people who've been teaching street law. I just think that some of them, we will look at them in a different way when we're teaching virtually. Some of these concepts seem very new to law professors who were taking the courses with me this summer. And I think spending time teaching virtually will actually make all of us better teachers, because we have to be so intentional about everything that we do. We have to plan even more than we did before, which isn't to say that we didn't all plan a ton before. But what could be asynchronous? You know, what will we do live? What will the students do on their own? How will all those pieces fit together? The planning is almost more, or I don't say almost, I think it's more to teach virtually. And then we really need to think about how our students are learning. And more importantly than that even, is how are we going to know if they're learning? You know, in a class, we take for granted that we can look around at puzzled faces, or we'll walk around and we're going to see a student not contributing to their group or not answering the questions on the worksheet. And if a student gets lost in class, they're just going to ask their neighbor what's going on. None of those things can happen in a virtual space. So we have to be a lot more intentional about the questions we ask. And I know that Mina and Delali both mentioned that, really thinking about how you're going to ask something and having multiple ways to ask the same question. And I know, does anyone have any questions was never a great way to actually find out whether your students had any questions, but it is really ineffective in a classroom full of teenagers who may not be anxious to throw a question out. So we need to take time to really ask students to restate the instructions in their own words before we start an assignment, or ask students what they think was the most interesting point in the article that you guys read, that you read together as a class, similar to what I just asked you guys to do. So you need to ask questions where the students can give you feedback that will tell you whether they understood either the activity that you just did or the instruction that you just gave. A professor who taught at Cali this summer discussed something that she called the muddiest point, which I kind of liked, which is to ask the students to share what they thought was the most confusing thing that they'd covered in class that day. And from there, you can revisit things that the class is struggling with. But because it's a group activity, because you're asking everybody to say what they thought was confusing, one student's not going to feel self-conscious saying, oh, I didn't understand that, because now everybody's talking about the thing they found challenging. And if all of this sounds time consuming, I think that it is, but I also think that it's worth it. Even before COVID, I always told my law students that they aren't teaching a bar prep course. This is not about coverage. This is about students developing skills. They need to be active and engaged members of the community. One of the most surprising things for us over the summer was how much less we could cover on Zoom than we did when we were in the classroom. Most of the activities we used this summer were adapted for Zoom, but were based on activities we had done in previous years, and it took way longer. Which is why I think Nina mentioned that we ended up kind of creeping into the break sometimes, which we really didn't want to do. It takes time to put kids in the breakout rooms. It takes time for them to pull up worksheets from Google Classroom. Everything takes time, which is I think why Mina was referencing the time it takes to pull them back out of a breakout room. It seems silly, but if you're putting them in breakout rooms 3 times in a class and you're losing that extra minute every time, all those things sort of add up. So one of the things I really learned and that I'm taking into our fall semester is to be extremely thoughtful and intentional about what we're going to choose to teach during this limited time, because I know we're going to cover a lot less than we have in previous semesters. I also think lesson outcomes or objectives will be critical this semester. I often think my street law students are secretly or not so secretly rolling their eyes at me because I'm always picking on the outcomes that they write. They write these amazing lessons, but then the outcomes are like unmeasurable afterthoughts. I'm always asking them, how do you know if your students will be able to do this? How are you going to measure that? What is it you really want them to be able to do at the end of the day? And I think that takes on even greater importance in the virtual world. Really thinking about how are we going to be able to tell if our students can do what we want them to do as a result of this lesson. So if I have any of my students on this Zoom, be forewarned, I'm going to be super picky this semester about the outcomes that you write. So interactivity. We all know that interactivity is a hallmark of street law. How are we going to do that on a virtual world? Or that? Or that? Or that? So I'm not going to tell you that it's going to be the same because it's not. We can't go into the semester thinking that we can take our classroom and just put it online. It's going to be different, but I don't think that means it can't be interactive. And I know my law students alluded to this, and I know it can be controversial, but both New York Law School and our partner high school require cameras to be on unless a student has contacted us to tell us that they can't. The students interact so much more if they can see each other. Breakout rooms we've talked about a lot. Makes such a big difference to have those extra law students in the breakout rooms. Polls are great. I know there are poll programs out there that are way more advanced than the Zoom poll. But I think the Zoom one does everything I needed to do, and it's fully integrated. So the students don't have to have access to another platform to complete it. And you can even write the polls in advance. I think Delali mentioned that, and then just upload them to your meeting in advance. So Zoom provides the template for you. So I'm going to show you the first part of a lesson I wrote for Summer Bridge on the First Amendment and protest. So can someone write in the chat what is depicted in this photo? Now, normally in the classroom, we would just have the students raise their hand to answer this, but there's a lot of you here. Do we have an answer? Delali, is there an answer in the chat?
Yes, everyone got it. The 1963 March on Washington.
Right, this is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. making his I Have a Dream speech, which I didn't know when we were scheduling this meeting that it would be the 57th anniversary of him making that speech. So Ben, can we launch poll number 1? So this is the poll that our students had, and you can answer it. We were asking our students to tell us whether or not this was speech. So we got 93%. All right, thank you. Ben, we can end the poll. Oh, sharing results, right, 93%. Excellent. So, right, this is an example of speech. So in class, we looked at a series of photos. We looked at a series of photos and discussed whether the students thought they were speech. So we started with that one. This is a letter from a Birmingham jail. And we looked through a variety of photos. I'm just gonna show you guys. We're gonna vote on one more. So someone want to tell us in the chat what's depicted in this photo? Delali, do we get an answer?
Yes, Black Lives Matter protest.
Right, this man is protesting the death of George Floyd. And so can we have the poll for this one? Is this speech? All right, can we share the results, Ben? So we have about 88% of people think that it is speech, and we've got some unsure and some no. Thanks, we can stop sharing the poll. I think I can get rid of it. So this is symbolic speech, and these images led to great discussions. What is this man trying to do with his t-shirt? Is he trying to say that he actually can't breathe? Do we think that this message is likely to be understood by the people around him? So the students just naturally had these conversations about symbolic speech, and they were actually applying the legal standard without even knowing what the standard was. But they really came up with it on their own, and I thought that the photos really worked well, and I thought this was, you know, one of our favorite lessons that happened over the summer. They were having interactive, critical thinking discussions. Now, would I have preferred to have these conversations in person? Absolutely, but it still worked. So I tried to be very intentional about the images I chose. The students at our school are almost 100% students of color, and I wanted them to see people who looked like them exercising their First Amendment rights. The last thing I want to say about these images is, again, I purposely did not put any words on these slides. And that's because of a presentation I attended on using media to teach and how our brains process that media. The speaker was focused on Richard Mayer's 12 Principles of Multimedia Learning, which some people may have heard about. He focuses on how our brain processes information and media. And he explains that images together with narration work really well. But when you start adding extraneous on-screen text, that it becomes really difficult for learners to process the words they're hearing and the images they're seeing together with text that they're trying to read. It kind of overloads the brain. So his suggestion is to eliminate all unnecessary texts, but he does believe that people learn better from words and images rather than just words alone. And that we should use media only if it's actually contributing to or clarifying what you want the students to learn. Otherwise, it's just taking up space in our students' working memory. Now, we're not going to be teaching our street law lessons by PowerPoint, but most of us will be showing visuals and sharing our screens. So the last thing I want to talk about is community. This is usually what the last day of each semester looks like. The high school students all huddled together with their law students. They form a genuine bond as a group over the course of the semester. And I worried a lot about whether or not we could even come close to this kind of community in a virtual setting. And I'm actually going to have Delali and Mina comment on community in their online classrooms.
So for me, building a community in the classroom was just really important. Our students didn't know each other because they were eighth graders from different schools coming into the same high school, and they definitely didn't know me. So as a facilitator, one of my goals was just to cultivate a community where every student felt like their voice was important, because I felt like that was crucial for their development. I did this by being very encouraging. Every comment to me was important, and I would tell them that by saying, really good point, reiterate their point, and then say how their point connected to our lesson for the day. And I found that it wasn't that our students who did have lower reading levels than eighth grade, I felt like it's not that they didn't understand the content, they just had issues building up their confidence. So I think that has to be established first before they can learn. Icebreakers were definitely very helpful, especially if you don't know your students. And also, I just wanted the students to be able to feel comfortable talking. So if they can talk about their favorite sport or hobby, then maybe they'll feel comfortable talking about what we have for them. As I mentioned, I signed in 5 to 10 minutes early just for small talk, or if someone had a question about the lesson prior, and then I would log off maybe like 5 minutes after class. I know, and that's also why I like the chat function. Some people don't want to necessarily say out loud, like, I'm confused, I have a question, but they felt comfortable privately messaging me. And one student even said, oh, could you stay on for a little after, and he was talking about how can he get into law school and the financial cost. So, you know, that just staying an extra 5 minutes can definitely help build a relationship with your students.
Thank you, Delali.
So just like Delali said, I would try to start each class with just checking in with the students and like taking a few minutes to get them comfortable, like sharing their opinion and speaking to the group. And I would try to sort of remember little things that they may have mentioned, like if they have a dog or what their interests are, and kind of incorporate that into the conversation in the beginning, because if you kind of open the conversation as relaxed and they feel comfortable speaking, then hopefully that will carry over into the actual conversation. And that did work for quite a few of my students. But I think that the hardest part of any Zoom meeting is getting everyone else to feel comfortable as they would in person. I think that it's really easy to feel like because you're speaking through a screen, the people on the other side can't see you, or they can't hear you, or they can't understand you. And so I think in class it's very obvious when the teacher's looking at you or wants your participation, but through the screen it's sort of impossible to feel that pressure or that feeling like you can be involved. So that's why I found it very important to kind of find those little bits of facts about the students to kind of bring up to them, just to sort of reinforce that I do see you, I do hear you, and you are a very important part of this class. You're not just a member of an audience. And I think that that helps students feel like they could speak up more.
Thank you, guys. I told you they were superstars. All right, thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. That was a super great overview. In just the last 5 or 10 minutes here, and I want to try to get everyone out so you can go have your Friday evening glass of wine or tea or whatever it is you do to celebrate the weekend. But we want to make sure that you all have a chance to meet each other and sort of share a little bit. So we're going to break into small groups just for a few minutes, probably 7 minutes or so, and just in your groups, introduce yourselves, tell your group mates sort of who you are and what your plans are this fall, if you know what they are. And then you can talk about if any of these sort of lessons learned or tips resonate with you, or if you have experiences that you want to share that might be useful. So we're just going to break into groups now for, let's call it 7 minutes. When we come back, we'll do a debrief of a minute or two, and then we will be out of here and everyone can get to their weekend early. So Ben, let's go ahead and hit the breakout rooms. All right, looks like we lost a few people, which is not surprising because we're 3 minutes over time. But thanks to all of you for participating, and I hope you had some good conversations. Without getting too bogged down, would anyone like to share any sort of thoughts from their group? We'll just take maybe 1 or 2 people. Were there any lessons learned or new ideas or conversations that you think are worthwhile to share with the whole group? We'll just go on sort of a first come, first serve basis. So if you want to unmute yourself and share for just a minute or 2 before we wrap up, feel free.
Well, I think the point that John made in our group was very well taken, and that is we have a much greater tolerance for mistakes.
I think it looks like Ben might be frozen. Does anyone else have something they'd like to contribute from their group?
I suppose just in our group, it was very interesting to hear about the technological constraints that marginalized communities or marginalized sections in communities have in relation to inability to access Zoom or other things given the situation that they may be in. So that was just something else that really we had to consider. So really impressed by some of the thoughts that the people on the call with myself and Jennifer had.
I was impressed to find an old, I don't mean old, another long ago Georgetown Law School alumnus of the street law program where it originated in my group. So that was kind of cool.
I also did the Georgetown program.
Oh, did you? I bet I did it a lot before you did. Where did you teach? I taught at McKinley Tech.
I was at Banneker.
Ah, my colleague Laura from our breakout group was at Woodrow Wilson.
Excellent.
And I taught the prison program at the Georgetown way back in the day. Late 70s.
Cool. What year were you doing it there?
77 to the end of 81.
I was there in 77. That's when I was doing street law.
It sounds like street law has come a long way since its humble beginnings at Georgetown to going around the world and around the U.S. So I just really want to thank everyone for joining and participating today. When you registered, if you agreed to have your contact info shared, I'm going to send out a list probably first thing next week with everyone's contact info, just so that you can reach out to the people in your group or people you were chatting with and continue these conversations. The goal of these types of webinars is, to provide a little bit of information that's hopefully useful, but really to connect all of you with each other so that you can lean on each other. And obviously, feel free to reach out to us at Street Law. We've got resources, we've got some experience doing this, and we've got friends who know a lot more than we do who we can point you to. So we're always willing to help. And we're hoping that we're gonna be able to do a couple more webinars throughout the fall and the winter on a variety of topics related to street law. So if you have ideas or you are interested in leading one of these webinars and have a good idea, please reach out to me, let me know, and we can try to organize another one. So I have taken up 7 minutes more of your time than I promised. So it's I think it's officially time to call it a session, but I want to thank everyone again and hope to be in touch with all of you and see you all again soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Lee and Jennifer and all at Street Inc.
Yeah.